English humour, a jaloping gurney through the wilder reaches of English language humour. Part 15. Wordplay, Part 2. Ik onwinklige vragen werks en nathvat. I'm probably not pronouncing it right, but that's the start of a very old riddle. It's in a book called the Exeter Book, which Limericks donated to the Cathedral Library in the 10th century. The verses are from around the years 960 to 990. It contains Old English poetry and riddles, 90 of them, like the one I attempted to read at the beginning of this segment. That, roughly translated, means I have learned that something grows here and continues like this. It swells and gets bigger, and there's something over it. A woman grabs this boneless thing with her hands around it, and then covers this swollen thing with a garment. And we're supposed to guess that that is, of course, as you already knew, a bowl full of dough ready for making bread. And it's a short step, I think, from this 10th century humour to Max Miller and Benny Hill. Yes, even Benny Hill liked a good pun and a bit of suggestive language. Indeed, one of the acts on the New Faces spoof was a couple called Novak and Good, who were joined in a subsequent week by their new member Steele, making them Steele, Novak and Good. And the two Ronnies loved a wordplay as well as the already mentioned Four Candles sketch. They have the brilliant Swedish subtitles parody, where they managed to sustain a conversation in a restaurant by using just the names of English letters. So on the subtitles you would see L-O, and this would be hello in English with a Swedish accent. This develops to things like F-U-N-E-X, S-V-F-X, V-F-X, N-V-F-M-N-X, which isn't that far from a Swedish conversation that goes
U-N-E-T
1 T.
1 T.
Okay, M, X, and T. M, X, and T for 1.
VFM10EX.
You said U-F-X.
Y-F-N-U-N-E-X.
IFE10M.
But for now, back to Exeter. The Vikings came over, well, the Danes, that we know as Vikings, and they brought their Old Norse language with them. Now, Old Norse and the Anglo-Saxon that was spoken came from the same root, and so were mutually intelligible, but of course they'd grown apart over the centuries. And in order to make things easier, presumably for trading purposes, the new invaders, who had their own part of Great Britain, they simplified our language for us. Before they came, the plural of goat was gak, lamb, lambru, house, house, iron, and so on. But they said, oh, just put an S on the end. And it seems the locals agreed. Also, they managed to prune our verbs of their various endings. A lot of languages have to change the ending. They call it inflecting, whether you're speaking to you or they or on behalf of us or I. And in older English, where there was thou goest and you go, can still be seen in Shakespeare's plays and still be heard in the north of England. But even the intimate form of you, which was thou, also went. There is no goest or goeth. And Old Norse brought us a lot of words which are very basic to us now. Night, day, sun, first, sky, window, third, even the pronouns they, them, their. And note, they're all short words. So what's this got to do for wordplay? Well, short, simplified words with a lack of inflection pave the way to anagrams, palindromes, malapropisms, and spoonerisms, which is what we're going to look at now. Anagrams. Easy. You take the letters of a word, jumble them up, and make another word. Dog could be God, goat could be toga, and so on. And not just one word. You can make them from many words, or from people's names. So Tony Blair MP could be jumbled up and remade into I'm Tory Plan B. Not in themselves humorous, but with the possibility of humour in them. And also not exclusively English, obviously. Again, the French like a good wordplay. And there Louis XIII had a royal anagrammist, Thomas Billon, for sticklers for history. Robert Hooke, the English scientist, wrote his discoveries in anagrams in order to hide them. And I think it was Luis Buñuel who anagramized Salvador Dali's name into Avida Dollars after his American sojourn. Here are a few anagrams. Let's see if you like them. Dormitory, dirty room. Mother-in-law, woman Hitler. The Morse code. Here come dots. The best things in life are free. Nail biting refreshes the feet. This does reach more impressive realms. It was a dark and stormy night is the first line of a novel by Edward Bulwer Lytton, often taken to be the worst beginning of a novel ever. It was a dark and stormy night. The rain fell in torrents, except at occasional intervals, when it was checked by a violent gust of wind, which etc., etc. Has been anagramized, the whole damn lengthy sentence, and comes out like this. Tut tut, Bulwer Lytton's known penchant for inelegant, stagnant, over-affected, cost-inflated prose evokes mirth 100 years hence. Aha! A well-known comic strip talent hatches it. A textual gag for a dog. Snoopy wags his tail, sits at his typewriter, fidgets, and then distills a classic theme, quote, "It's raining, there's no light, ... end quote. Absolutely brilliant. See if you can guess what these anagrams are of. In one of the bard's best thought-of tragedies, our insistent hero Hamlet queries on two fronts about how life turns rotten. And a clue here is the two fronts would be to be or not to be. How about this one? Tin Man ran, left planets, makes large stride, pins flag on moon. On to Mars. Well, that's a rehash of Neil Armstrong's famous sentence on landing on the moon. And if you want to look that one up, there are quite a few very clever anagrams of that one. Staying with pure wordplay, palindromes, Greek word meaning running back. Well, these run forward and back, the first words ever uttered. Ever sentence, according to the English, were a palindrome. Madam, I'm Adam. Now you can see, you say that backwards, you get the same. Madam, I'm Adam. Here's quite a famous one. A man, a plan, a canal, Panama. That's a palindrome from 1948. Here's one from 100 years earlier, so we're in Napoleonic times, and that's a clue. Able was I, ere I saw Elba. Ere being the old way of saying until. And who remembers the famous racehorse Red Rum? Not a palindrome in itself, but the word murder backwards. From this neat palindrome, murder for a jar of red rum. Even the ancient Greeks liked a palindrome, and you would often find inscribed on fountains, nipson anomemata, memonan opsin, which can be read forward and backward, meaning wash the sin as well as the face. And the Latins, as we know from some graffiti which was buried in ash by the volcano in Herculaneum, have an incredible word square. A 5x5, which reads Sator arepo tenet opera rotas. The ploughman arepo leads with his hand the plough. This can be read in the word square, forwards, backwards, top to bottom and bottom to top. Quite incredible. But you can see there how Latin also would be a language that would suit itself to this kind of game. Here's another Latin one. In girum imus nocte et consumimur igni. We go in a circle at night and are consumed by fire. Read it forwards or backwards. Either way, it will describe moths. But this Latin was probably concocted in Europe by monks. Again, the palindrome's not in itself funny, but a nice indication of how the British love a word play. Some of them are quite funny though. American band Soundgarden has this as one of the titles of their songs. Satan, oscillate my metallic sonatas. Let's move on to clerihews. We've already seen the verse form the limerick. I'll remind you. A canner, exceedingly canny, one morning remarked to his granny, a canner can anything that he can, but a canner can't can he? We also have the clerihew, which, just by its very rhyme scheme and lack of scansion, lends itself to humour. Clerihew was invented by Edmund Clerihew Bentley when he was 16 and getting bored in a science class. They were teaching him about Humphrey Davy, so into his head popped Sir Humphrey Davy, abominated gravy. He lived in the odium of having discovered sodium. So that's what he started off, and others have had a pop as well. Here's another one of his though. Sir Christopher Wren said, I'm going to dine with some men. If anyone calls, say I am designing St. Paul's. John Stuart Mill, by a mighty effort of will, overcame his natural bonhomie and wrote Principles of Political Economy. Daniel Defoe lived a long time ago and had nothing to do, so he wrote Robinson Crusoe. The Spanish people think Cervantes equal to half a dozen Dantes, an opinion resented most bitterly by the people of Italy. That last one is by G.K. Chesterton. Now, malapropisms. We saw these in the early stump monologues of the minstrelsies, deliberately parodying people by assuming that the speaker doesn't know they're getting the word wrong, but of course you deliberately are. Again, they have a longer history. We can go back to Shakespeare's Much Ado About Nothing, where Constable Dogberry says to the governor, Our watch, sir, have indeed comprehended 2 auspicious persons, meaning apprehended 2 suspicious persons. But here, of course, Shakespeare's laughing at the low level of education of Constable Dogberry, who bravely tries to use a vocabulary above his station. Let's go back to the source of the malapropism, Mrs. Malaprop. 1775 was the year of the debut of Sheridan's play. Act 3, Scene 3. Here, Mrs. Malaprop says to Captain Absolute, Sure, if I reprehend anything in this world, it is the use of my oracular tongue, and a nice derangement of epitaphs, which we take to mean, if I apprehend anything in this world, it is the use of my vernacular tongue, and a nice arrangement of epithets. Malapropism was one of Stan Laurel's comic effects. We're like 2 peas in a pot, he would say, for example, instead of pod. And British comedian Ronnie Barker was a great fan of malapropisms, and also spoonerisms, as in his sketch, An Appeal on Behalf of the Loyal Society for the Relief of Sufferers from Pismenunciation. So what's a spoonerism? Well, a spoonerism is where you take the initial letter of one word and swap it for the initial letter of another word. Why is it called a spoonerism? Because according to legend, William Archibald Spooner, Oxford Don, who died in 1930, was apt to use this verbal tic, and so they became known as spoonerisms. Often used humorously, it says in the dictionary. This is a little bit exaggerated, as Mr. Spooner did have problems with his words sometimes, but didn't always spoonerise them. Sometimes he would mix the words up in a quasi-spooneristic way. Kinkering Kongs, their titles take. Kinkering Kongs instead of conquering kings. There were witnesses to that one. But nobody actually heard Spooner say the following, although they are all listed as classic spoonerisms. It is now customary to cuss the bride. I am tired of addressing beery wenches. Pardon me, Padam, this pie is occupied. Can I sew you to another sheet? You have hissed all my mystery lectures, and were caught fighting a liar in the quad. Having tasted 2 worms, you will leave by the next town drain. Of course, that last one is far too elaborate to be real, but contains a nice 4 spoonerisms if you'd like to untangle them. Still, it's a nice way of playing with words. The cat popped on its little drawers, when you mean to say the cat dropped on its little paws. It's quite funny. A friend of mine was in France once and tried to say love at first sight, which is in French un coup de foudre, a blow of foudre, what would that be? Anyway, coup de foudre, but happened to spoonerize it, so it came out as a fou de coudre, which his French friend laughed at and told him that in English that would mean, well, what would it mean? A madness of sewing, which the English friend immediately spoonerized back into a sadness of mowing, which is quite evocative. And so we pass the time of day, if introduced to a couple called Lynn and Graham, in our heads automatically spoonerizing to Grin and Layham, unable to read about Friar Tuck. So here I suggest we glaze our arses to the queer old Dean and sign off for now.